My guest this week on Leaders and Friends is a great friend of mine, Karan Bhatia. Karan and I worked together for more than 10 years at GE, where he ran government relations. He started really in lots of different government service. He was the assistant U.S. trade representative, which had kind of a diplomatic level inside the government. And now Karan leads government affairs for Alphabet and Google. So he's seen kind of old companies, new companies, government, everywhere in between. Karan, it's so great to see you again, and you're such a fantastic leader. And I look forward to kind of the audience here getting a chance to learn from you. So
Well,
welcome. Good to see you, Karan.
thanks, Jeff. It's great to see you too, and fun to do this. So thanks for
Yeah.
inviting me.
Karan, let's start with just you and I. You're younger than I am, but we kind of had overlapped in a career where globalization was a good thing,
Yeah,
where selling around the world, building relationships around the world was considered to be fantastic. And you and I worked together from Beijing to Delhi to Brussels and everywhere in between. And now it's almost viewed as a bad thing. It's almost viewed as a negative or a challenge. Uh, how do you reflect on that? What happened? And,
yeah.
and, and what can you tell people that really want to be part of global organizations today?
Yeah. Jeff, you're exactly right, and I reflect on it even before my time at GE when I was in government. I was working for a president, George Bush, George W. Bush, who, one of his deepest commitments, philosophical commitments, was that trade and global engagement, global leadership by the United States economically was a good thing, and would lead to prosperity in the United States and help countries around the world. And you look at where we are today, where in the United States, but also elsewhere on both sides of the political spectrum, there's more, not just skepticism of trade and globalization, but real antipathy to it. Like, it's an applause line for candidates today that they're against international commerce, international trade. And I think for many of us who grew up in that era, it strikes us as being so antithetical to what we know and what we've seen. Whether I was at GE or at Google, I see the benefits of every day what we're doing for our employees here and for our employees around the world from that kind of engagement. But somewhere we lost the narrative, right? We lost the ability to sell that vision to the American people and people elsewhere, or maybe we just didn't try hard enough. Like, maybe somewhere along the way there was a problem there. And frankly, public policy, probably there were mistakes made. Like, we ignored significant chunks of people who had been adversely impacted, had been left behind. And so, look, I think, long story short, we are in a different era. The days of the 80s, 90s, where globalization was seen as positive, and where global institutions, things like the WTO, were seen as being important bedrocks of international commerce, just don't exist anymore. Having said all of that, the one thing that I would say is, actually, when you look at it, global trade, global commerce, the global focus of big companies remains as strong as ever, right? I mean, Google wouldn't be Google today. GE wouldn't be GE if it weren't for its ongoing investments and engagement around the world. And so what I've said is, the focus of globalization has actually gone from this belief in big institutions or rules of the road very much to every company running its own foreign policy. Every company needing its own approach to how is it selling its activities to governments, to its employees, to its citizens, or to citizens around the world, communities. So I think it's become just a lot more complicated for CEOs. You led that transition. You saw it and led it and helped GE get through it. And I think a lot of other companies are going through that as well.
Yeah. Do you think, just going back, you kind of touched on it, but did leaders miss a cue here? Karan, did we just kind of not, were we too impervious to the fact that, our fellow citizens didn't think, things like outsourcing were such a good idea
Yeah.
and things like that. And, I sometimes, it's a super complicated theme, but, I think to a certain extent, the business leaders missed some of the things they should have been looking at.
Completely. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, they did, and I think some of it was, short-term imperatives drive decisions that when you are able to step back over the longer term, you can sort of say, "Oh my God, guys, is this really the right thing for the
Yeah.
country, for employees, for everything else?" But that near-term imperative becomes irresistible. But yeah, absolutely, I think we did, and frankly, I think. I think this is a combination of the corporate sector. I think it's a combination of the private sector, of
Yeah.
government sector as well. I think the government never really got its head around what was going to be needed to
Yeah.
help workers transition and invest in that.
Yeah.
And so there were a few sops thrown, but today, you drive through parts of the country, the Midwest and elsewhere, that were really devastated by a variety of things, but among them, outsourcing.
Mm,
And yeah, you can understand why people are voting the
totally.
way they're voting.
Yeah. No, totally. Maybe one on more on globalization, Kron. Like, what's the best case you can think of for a relationship between the U.S. and China? Let's say
Yeah.
economically, and can anybody even be optimistic about it right now?
Well, whether you can be optimistic about it, I think that's a harder question because I don't see a lot of signs of. I mean, your best case scenario, I think, for the U.S. and China is that we bumble along here in a way that doesn't lead to an even worsening of the relationship
Yeah.
going forward. But what's the best case? Look, I mean, I think the best case continues to be, Jeff, that by virtue of trade and investment and engagement between the two, you do have American citizens better off than they would otherwise be, and you have Chinese citizens better off than they would otherwise be. I mean, this idea that you can simply shut off an entire, of the two great economies, that there can't be an engagement, there can't be overlap, just doesn't make sense. And you talk to any business, I mean, rest assured, every person in my job around the world is running scenarios for what happens if China invades Taiwan, right? What does that mean in terms of supply chains, and what does it mean in terms of impact on operations around the world? There's
Yep.
no good answer to that question.
Yeah.
That this is a disaster of huge proportions if it happens. But in some ways, that shows you that this idea of decoupling, as some would envision, is just not going to happen. And so we have to figure out a way to sort of get our way through this. And so it's going to be small confidence building measures along the way is the best I can envision.
Yeah. No. Shift gears, Kron, and talk a little bit about how do you deal. Uh, when you're, and we certainly had a little bit of G, but you really have now with Google. When you're a company of that size and importance, how do you navigate governments, elections,
Yeah.
all the things? I'm old enough now to remember when like Google was the apple of everybody's eye. It was the cute little search company,
Yeah.
and
Not
now
so cute, not so little, not so
not so
cute. Yeah.
little. And yeah, so how do you in your seat, how do you bridge the,
Yeah.
again, populism and just government conflict and regulations and stuff like that? What are you working on, and how do you see it?
Yeah. Well, elections are a big thing that I'm working on right now because this has obviously been the year of elections, and from a Google perspective, I mean, every company is trying to sort of figure out, okay, what's the new government in place, and how do we build connections and relationships and take the relationships forward. I think in Google's case, there's always a special significance to elections because during the elections themselves, Google and our products become very much in focus because people are looking to Google for information about the elections and the candidates themselves are carefully studying our products balanced and all of that. So there's a unique sort of tie-in with elections right now that where it's very front and center. But look, just more generally, I think Jeff, when you're thinking about this very populist, largely anti-big business, certainly anti-big tech, but anti-big
Mhm.
business more broadly sentiments, um, you have to be thinking creatively about sort of your narrative and how do you go about selling the value of what it is you're doing. And look, it's not always easy, but the reality is that big companies continue to be largely the source of most R&D that's happening, bringing extraordinary amounts of investment. Google alone last quarter put $11 billion into physical infrastructure, data centers,
Mm.
subsea cables, the things that are making the global economy work. That's as much as the whole CHIPS Act is envisioning alone. So, and that's not to mention Microsoft and Apple and everybody else. So the reality is that these big companies, while we may not find them politically appealing in some sense, they are absolutely critical to the success of the functioning of the economy and honestly to addressing some of the big challenges that we as a society want to find solutions to. So
Mhm.
energy, food security, healthcare, it's companies like GE, it's companies like Google that are going to be core to reaching that. So trying to help educate policymakers, even in a time of populism, about how, okay, take your shots publicly, but realize when you're actually setting policy, you need big companies to be working with government and doing the right things.
Yep.
And hopefully you get that message across.
Karan, artificial intelligence clearly adds another layer of
Huge.
complexity. Like if you thought about like what needs to kind of get us on the right path there so that we
Yeah.
don't, stop technology, but we make it palatable to
Yeah.
people. Like what do you have to do in that regard?
Yeah, we're spending a lot of time thinking about this. Won't surprise you, Jeff, on AI. And look, I think what we've said, but I think it's frankly the way government should be thinking about it as well, is this is a space, quintessential space where you need to be thinking about it with three words in mind: bold, responsible, and together, right?
Mhm.
Bold, in other words, we have got to seize the opportunity in front of us. I mean, it is so clear to me and to us that if we can get this right, this can be a game changer. This can be the productivity. And I mean, the great productivity enhancer of the last 25 years was what we were talking about before. It was outsourcing. It was this is a technological and frankly uniquely U.S. right now capability, or U.S. and China capability to be able to sort of get that next level of productivity. So we got to be bold, but the responsibility point comes to the fore as well. And I think this is less regulation, although there are regulatory things that can be done, but it's more companies standing up and appreciating the power that they've got with some of these tools and putting in place guardrails themselves. And then lastly, the together point, this is a really unique moment in time. People have analogized this to the time when nuclear power was brought to the fore, back in the 50s and 60s. The difference in my mind is back then, nuclear power was the province of five or six governments, and it was governments and it was Western governments, right?
Right.
Today, you've got AI, which is already largely ubiquitous around the world, and it's in the hands of the private sector. And so if you're going to create some set of international rules or regulations around this, it's really going to have to involve a new level of collaboration between public and private sector. So it's hugely consequential. Maybe the biggest thing that we're working on as a public
Yep.
policy
No,
team.
that's a super good answer. I think I use the nuclear analogy as well. And I would actually say in the 1950s, the industry and the government around the world did a fantastic job to,
Yeah,
say in subsequent years, it hasn't been as good, but the early
yeah,
days were exceptional. Maybe one last question on leadership, Karan, is you've navigated governments, two big companies that both have their own culture, and you've done well at at everything you've done, like what can we all learn from you, and how does somebody stay adaptable and flexible and able to kind of change
Uh,
as they go through a career?
well, that's super kind and high words of praise, Jeff. And I would say I feel just incredibly lucky. I've had honestly, the privilege of working, my last three roles have been for three institutions that I have so much, I just respect for and feel passionately about, namely Google and GE, iconic American companies that represent great things, and the U.S. government itself. So I feel privileged. But to your and let me also just say, have worked for great leaders in each place. Yourself at GE, Sundar here at Google, and in the U.S. government, getting to work for President Bush and people like Rob Portman was a treat. In terms of my own look, I managed to get real joy out of each of these jobs, and it's largely, I think, because I've been surrounded by great people. So I think a large part of it is, to the extent you can control that, hire really good people and people who you want to be with and who you get a lot out of just kicking ideas around. That's the way I've managed, and I find that to be enriching for me. Know what you don't know and trust the people who you brought in to be good counselors and advisors. I certainly learned that in government, and it's been true in the private sector as well. And then just intellectual curiosity. I know you are a big reader as well. I try to do that as well. Just open the blinders and look around. So those are just a few of the things.
Yeah.
But again, I feel incredibly lucky.
No, you're such a joy to work with, and a great sense of humor, and it was always great
In
fun.
my business, you have to have a great sense of humor.
You got to be able to laugh,
Otherwise,
brother.
you're going to cry.
When you're flying into Delhi and it's Diwali and you've got to go do a panel at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and you're
Yeah.
together, it's great. I think we're like 92 days away from the election. I'm not going to ask you to pick one or the other, but if you said like, if you said to people that were listening or somebody around the world or something, like what is like one thing that you think is going to push it one way or the other that maybe nobody's talking about right now, or is everything out in front of us and it's just going to be, kind of the way people feel the day they cast their
Yeah.
ballot?
Look, I mean, this is not a new thought. I think it's going to be close. I think it's coming down to, it'll be a handful of states. I mean, the best line I've heard about this, Jeff, and it's one that I subscribe to, is I think it's whoever this election is about ultimately is going to lose. That it's
That's a great. That is such a great line. Yeah.
yeah, if it ends up being that Trump's really in focus and that's who everybody's talking about at the end of the day, because the negatives for both of these candidates are pretty high, and
Mhm.
so you don't need to hit 21. You just need to beat the dealer on this one. So it's
Yeah.
stay on 14 or whatever it is. But I think largely it's going to be who over the course of the next 100 days makes the misstep,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
So
No, I think that's great. Well, Karan, thanks for being with us on Leaders and Friends. You're both, and so much wisdom about globalization and adaptability and change. It's great to be with you. So, Karan, thanks very much.
thanks, Jeff. It's been fun.
Good to see you.
You too.